So that will open us up to all the people who are attending here.
Excellent.
And let's see here. Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait for 1 minute for everyone to get into the Zoom room, and we'll get started. All right, while we're waiting for people to get in, I just have a couple of quick announcements. Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Klasky. I am the manager of public programs at the Michener, and I'm really excited that you're all here for our first ever Virtual Earth Day. Happy Earth Day, everyone. Like I said, I have a couple of quick announcements, and then we'll get right to our presentation. First, as we all get used to attending virtual events, the Michener wants to make sure we are providing you with the best possible experience online. If you have a moment after today's event, we ask that you consider completing this quick virtual program survey, which I'm going to put in the chat box right now. There we go. Next, we know now more than ever, the museum and the arts are our window into a wider world. And all of us at the Michener are beyond thrilled to have your support today. If you like what you see and you are able to do so, I encourage you to make a donation to our annual fund. Every contribution, big or small, makes a huge difference to our ability to continue presenting programs like this at no cost now and in the future. You can make that donation at our annual fund support page. I'm going to post that link right now. Next, I wanted to make sure I let you all know that while the Michener Museum is temporarily closed, you can still experience a lot of our museum content from your home. We've collected all of our online resources, which includes videos, pictures of our collection, and many more amazing resources, all for adults, kids, students, and teachers. We've collected them all in one place as a resource for you. And you can check them all out at this link. I'm going to put it in the chat box now. And lastly, I wanted to go over some of the features of this Zoom webinar, which we are all in right now. So this is a Zoom webinar. Only the presenter and myself will be able to hear or see each other. So those of you who are tuning in at home, feel free to run your vacuum in your pajamas or eat your lunch, whatever you need to do. Just like TV, we won't be able to hear or see you or each other. But that doesn't mean that you can't interact. You'll see at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be some icons for a chat feature. If you click that, you'll be able to chat with myself or Dr. Dohle or any of the other attendees. You can also use the Q&A feature, which is a little bit over here. That feature will let you submit questions for Dr. Dohle, who will answer them towards the end of the program. So while Dr. Dohle's speaking, you can feel free to put in your questions there. Now, finally, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Sarah Dohle. Sarah Dohle earned her PhD in plant biology, developing tools for breeders and researchers studying lima beans. She has worked as a visiting researcher at the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center. I love this acronym, the CIMMYT in Mexico, studying high vitamin A corn, and the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, CIAT, in Colombia, studying bean diversity. Sarah currently works with Delaware Valley students and community members in the participatory plant breeding programs to develop regionally adapted, unique varieties of produce, starting with the next hottest pepper, beans, squash, and tomatoes. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dohle by virtually clapping your hands. And for to do this, I want us all to type in the chat feature our favorite vegetable. I'm going to chat in plantains. Is that a vegetable? I like it because it's like a banana and a potato. Oh, everyone join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Dohle.
Thank you so much, Matt. I'm very happy to be here with all of you today. So definitely do type in questions if they come up while I'm talking, and I'll be very happy to get to them at the end of my presentation. So I'm used to, like Matt said, I teach in the plant science department at Delaware Valley here in Doylestown. And so I'm used to talking to students who have been studying plants. So I'm really excited to be talking to a broader audience of people who are excited about Earth Day, care about art, care about nature. So my primary topic today will be talking about biodiversity in agriculture. And I think we're more accustomed to thinking of biodiversity in natural ecosystems, right? National parks and wild places. But considering the diversity that's in agriculture fields is also important for strong ecosystems and a strong food system. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen with you guys. Oh, and by the way, this picture behind me is near that International Center for Tropical Agriculture in Colombia, South America, where I was studying beans. Okay, so I'm gonna share my PowerPoint and continue talking. All right, so backyards to big farms, biodiversity in our food systems. All right, so biodiversity is really important in our agriculture systems because agriculture covers so much land here in the United States and across the globe. I'm going to show you a few maps showing land usage. So over a third of the US land is pasture and rangeland. This could be more managed pastures like what we have here in Pennsylvania for horses, or it could be like what they have out west where the rangeland is less managed and more arid, but it takes up a lot of space, a third of the United States. Another large land use area is forests. A lot of them manage timberlands for paper and lumber production, right? So not what maybe you think of as traditional agriculture land, but it's still managed for production regions, and it covers a quarter of the country. All right, and then this crop production land is probably what we think of most commonly when we think about agriculture production. These would be the plants that are planted every year. So over on the West Coast, we have a lot of our fruit, nuts, vegetable production, those high value crops. A lot of what's produced in the middle of the country is our grains, corn, soy, wheat. We have a lot of cotton production in the South. And so all of this crop production land takes up a fifth of the country. So if you combine all the land use together, you start seeing that across the United States, we don't actually have that much wild spaces. So here, the blue at the top is the federal wilderness lands, right? So yeah, that's important to have diversity. But if most of our space is taken up by animal pastures, by managed woodlands, or by grain production or other food production, it's also important in those spaces to maintain biodiversity, right? Well, I don't want to forget about the pink area up here, which represents the urban and rural housing areas. And all of these places have lawns, right? Or gardens outside of them. And those are also taking up a considerable portion of land. And so maintaining biodiversity in these areas could also be important, right? So it's not just in the wild places that we need biodiversity, but it's every place. Within reason, because there's also some very good reasons to have uniformity in some of these areas. All right, so just a nice image of why we value biodiversity in natural places and a nice diverse area. So what grows on this green mountain on the top with the shrubs is different than what grows in the front that's still green, and then the dry grasses, right? So each of these little micro environments right next to each other may have different soil types. They may be hit by the sun at a different angle, right? And they're providing different pollinator sources for insects, or different nutrients for soil microbes, something like that. So, and they also have different resistance to pests and pathogens. So if a new insect comes to town that likes this yellow flower in front, well, maybe it'll kill all that yellow flower, but the purple flower behind it will persist and grow into its space. So a diverse ecosystem is also a very resilient ecosystem to change. And with impending climate change, having a lot of diversity for when one type of plant is stressed, another type of plant could flourish, is going to be really important. So what does that look like in agriculture? So here we have in the top right corner some crop diversity in a farmer's market in San Jose, Costa Rica. Right? We have in the bottom left landrace corn growing along a country road in the Yucatan in Mexico. Okay, and you can see growing between the corn a whole lot of other vegetation. It's not just a monocrop cornfield. It also doesn't look like a particularly high yielding corn crop, but it's still some corn. In the top left is a coffee leaf, and on the coffee leaf are rust symptoms caused by a rust pathogen. So if the plantation that this coffee leaf came from is all the same variety of coffee plant, there's potential that that rust that is damaging that plant, that fungal pathogen, could kill the entire coffee plantation. All right, and then here looking in the right is, the bottom right are tuber diversities on the street in Cusco, Peru. Right, so Peru is known for its amount of potato diversity and tuber diversity. It's the origin of the potato. And what we're looking at here on the right is maybe something you're familiar with, the russet potato, and then a less familiar tuber on the left. All right, so this is the story of the potato famine. I think is the most well-known story of like the shock value to get people excited about biodiversity in agriculture and the need for it. And so as a refresher, back in the 1840s, most of the peasants in Ireland were living off of potatoes. That was their primary source of food. And potatoes are propagated clonally. They were all growing the same type of potato, the Irish lumper. A new pathogen, a new late blight arrived. The weather was bad, which allowed the pathogen to thrive. And because all of the potatoes were of the same clonal variety, the pathogen was able to attack all of the potatoes, and there was extreme crop failure. In combination with the crop failure and agriculture and food distribution policies, there wasn't another food source for a lot of the peasant farmers. So there was a lot of death and a lot of immigration away from Ireland in the 1840s. This map on the right is showing in the red areas a decrease in 25% or more of the population, and in the purple area in the middle, more than 30% of the population left Ireland. So good for the United States to get the Irish immigrants, but probably not worth all the suffering. So there is a huge amount of diversity that exists in potato. It just wasn't being utilized in Ireland, probably for a combination of reasons, right? But that diversity does exist. And somebody who is improving diversity in agriculture is not a new idea. Early farmers tried to do it. And this guy, Nikolai Vavilov, a Russian plant scientist who worked in the early 1900s, was very interested in improving and increasing diversity in agriculture, and in particular, breeding improved crop varieties for Russia to prevent famine. So Vavilov had an idea that he would travel around the world and see where the most diverse rice varieties were growing. He'd see where the most diverse wheat varieties were growing. He'd go see where the most diverse plantain varieties were growing, right? And he would collect seeds from the farmers in these areas, from the markets, and from the wild plants in the area, and take those seeds and the genetics that they contained back to Mother Russia and cross these exotic novel varieties with stress resistance to that foreign land to the Russian varieties to try to impart the stress resistance from the exotic variety. So maybe he could breed more drought tolerant wheat or something like that. So Vavilov was not correct about all of the centers of domestication and origin, but his idea of collecting seeds that represented genetic diversity that could be utilized as a toolbox to make improved crops was completely right. It's a slow iterative process to take a wild non-adaptive plant and breed it to a well-cultivated plant to make an improved variety, but it works. Okay, so Stalin, who was in charge at the time, was not really pleased with Vavilov's ideas. Vavilov ends up in one of Stalin's prisons as political prisoner because of his bougie ideas about genetics, which were later proved right. And he actually dies of starvation in one of the prisons. So that's a very sad story. But while Vavilov is in prison dying of starvation, he still has his entire scientific team in Leningrad preserving the seeds that he had spent his lifetime collecting. So there's a giant reservoir of seeds there. And then the Nazis show up and there's the siege of Leningrad, and people in the city start dying of starvation. But you have this building full of seeds that have been collected from all over the world by Vavilov. Well, many of the scientists in the building die, but those that don't live on to protect the seeds and prevent them from being looted. And when interviewed after the siege ended, one of the researchers was asked, was it hard to not eat the seeds even though you were starving? And they responded, well, it was hard to get out of bed, it was hard to put your pants on, it was hard to do everything, but it wasn't hard to not eat the seeds because we knew the genetics they contained were so important, right? Because they too thought that the idea of breeding these new varieties to prevent famine was worth them maybe losing their own life. So check out The Murder of Nikolai Vavilov by Peter Pringle. It's great, great read. Okay, so this is, in less than an hour, intro to genetics, evolution, and plant breeding. So hopefully I'll keep most of you guys with me. Plants have been evolving for millions of years, right? And across many different environments. And so those plants that have evolved to grow on a dry mountaintop have different genetics than the plants that have evolved to grow on a moist stream bed. So their DNA produces a specific trait, and that trait makes it easier for them to grow in these niche environments, right? And then only about 10,000 years ago, agriculture started. It was the end of the last ice age. Humans started to plant, harvest, and replant a subset of wild plants. And that subset of wild plants that grew in these cultivated environments were the ones that got to pass their genes on into agriculture, right? And so humans didn't try to grow everything from the wild, and of what they tried to grow, not everything was able to be cultivated because the conditions in a farmer's field are quite different than conditions in the wild. But those few plants that did succeed to be cultivated are the ones whose genetics got to be passed on into what we use in agriculture today. So between everything evolving in the wild for millions of years and what we ended up domesticating, somewhat by chance and somewhat by purpose, was a small set of what diversity does exist in the wild. And then within the last 500 years, we've had more conscious breeding programs, which have further narrowed the genetic bottleneck of what we're using to produce our food even more today. So what we're looking at here in this cartoon, imagine that these are seeds, the pentagons and the circles and the different colors, and they're all representing a different variety, different genetics, different backgrounds, right? And within each iteration of domestication and then crop breeding, you end up leaving out a whole bunch of the genetics that could have been included, right? Okay, so I'm going to talk about a specific example of corn because it's such an important crop globally, calorically, economically. And I think with a solid example, it's a little easier to understand this genetic narrowing of the base of our agriculture system. So on the left is teosinte. It's a wild relative of corn. It can actually still be hybridized to corn, which means you could cross it by rubbing the flower parts together and get a fertile offspring that looks something between teosinte and the domesticated corn. So you can tell they look very different. Teosinte is branching. It looks a lot more like a grass, right? It has very small ears. You wouldn't even call them ears. and these are the tassels at the top. And then modern corn, you have the tassel at the top, which produces the pollen, the male flower. You have the ear, which is the female flower that creates the seeds, right? And you have one central stalk and one very large ear, right? And so the wild relative and the domesticated one look very different from each other. And the wild one is adapted to a whole bunch of different habitats in Mexico. And the cultivated corn is what we now grow around the world. Okay, so that domestication event, it wasn't a single event. It was a series of events that happened probably about 10,000 years ago based on archaeological evidence, which has been found in Mesoamerica and southern Mexico, right? And that was 10,000 years ago, the domestication. Now, just in the last, I'll say, I think it was in the 1930s, we started making hybrid corn. Okay, so hybrid means to cross-pollinate, right? And so you could inbreed corn where the pollen goes from an individual's tassel to its ear to fertilize itself. That would be an inbred, very common in plants to inbreed. Or you would have a hybrid where the pollen moves from one tassel to a neighboring ear for a fertilization event. And this would result in a hybrid. Well, in the 1930s, scientists discovered that producing hybrid corn made a progeny that was stronger. It had hybrid vigor or heterosis. And suddenly, corn yields began to increase after having been stagnated for over 100 years. So here on the right is an image of how hybrid corn can be made manually in the field. You'd plant rows that you want to be your male parents that are going to be allowed to produce the tassels on top, which will contain the pollen, and you have rows that'll be your female parents, which are going to produce the ears with the silks on the top, on the side. So the pollen, and then the female rows have their tassels cut off manually by machine so that they don't produce any pollen because you don't want them to accidentally self-fertilize. So the pollen from the male lands on the silk of the ear, and that fertilizes the corn. Then the males are removed from the field, and only the seeds from these female parents are harvested, and that is hybrid corn, which has a higher yield and more vigor. However, it's kind of a lot of work to produce. It was worth it though, because looking at corn yields in the United States per acre starting in the 1850s, you can see that in the late 1930s, when hybrid corn seed began to be available, the yields began to increase. And so that's producing more corn on the same number of acres, finally, right? Then something happened later. In the late 50s, early 60s, methods of corn production changed again, where access to synthetic fertilizer and other inputs became more widely available, cheaper, and more effective. And so a combination of improved hybrid genetics, as well as improved management practices since the 50s, have allowed corn yields to continue to increase on average annually. We'll have some off years where yields are low, and that's associated with extreme weather events, usually droughts. I'm not going to make this doom and gloom. Okay, so in the last picture, I showed you how making hybrid corn with detasseling is a lot of work, right? But it results in higher value seeds, so it's worth it. Well, scientists figured out a way to, they found a mutant, actually a naturally occurring mutant, which produced inviable pollen. So there was no need to detassel the corn. And so therefore this mutant was used as a female parent to make, in a very cheap, efficient way, a whole bunch of progeny, right? Using that same female parent that had the infertile pollen. The corn itself of the next generation would be fertile because you need that to produce seeds. Well, this was so effective that it was used in 85% of the corn that was produced in the US in the early 1970s, this one female parent. It's a little bit of a simplification, but it's like that. Okay, well, the southern corn leaf blight also showed up in the US in the 1970s. It showed up in early Florida, sorry about that, and then quickly spread from Florida all the way up the Mississippi. And within a year, it caused estimates range between 15 to 50% of crop failure in fields that it arrived in. And so it wasn't quite as devastating as the potato famine, but it was very widespread, and those farmers that were hit did suffer economic loss, and those ripples were felt around the world. There was not starvation and there was not mass migration because our food system was diverse at the time. So although the corn crop was not diverse, not too much of our food system was reliant on the corn, so the massive crop loss did not result in death, which was nice. But the 70s weren't that long ago. And farmers weren't planting the same variety of corn. They were planting corn that had just a little short piece of DNA that was the same between them. But that short piece of DNA was the part that, besides making infertile pollen, also made it susceptible to the blight. So I'm talking like, yeah, we need to increase diversity, but how much diversity is there? Maybe we actually do have enough already. So looking at historical figures, so going back to around when the corn blight arrived, this is from the National Research Council from 1972, looking at three major crops, the hectares that they covered, their value, and then the total varieties. So maize, there were 197 varieties of maize planted in 1969. That's a lot, right? And there were 269 varieties of wheat planted. That sounds like a lot, right? However, the major varieties, which accounted for 71 and 50% of the acres, respectively, there were only 6 varieties planted on 71 acres. There were only 9 varieties planted on 50 acres. So although in total it looks like there's a lot of varieties, the majority of the acres were planted in very few varieties. And of these few varieties, it turns out they were pretty closely related. Right? And of the millet, there were only 3 varieties planted on 100% of the acres. So this is what makes researchers and people who study food production concerned, that if you have this much uniformity on this much acres, then there's potential for crop failure at the scale of the potato famine. Okay, however, this is old data, right? 1969. Well, sometime after this, the USDA stopped tracking variety of crops planted, right? So we still track species. We know how many acres of corn are planted. We know how many acres of soybeans, how many of tomatoes and lima beans, but we don't know what varieties are planted on those acres. So we don't know how much diversity is there. Okay, so this is a study that came out in 2015, and what it shows is the amount of diversity by crop, which is pretty nice to look at. So we're looking back in the 70s, late 1978, 87, 97, and 2012. And the hot colors signify low crop diversity, just 1 or 2 varieties. And this is at production scale, this isn't home gardeners. And then blue, the cool colors, represent a lot of diversity, more than 12 varieties. Right? So here in Pennsylvania, and what the trends vary. Some areas the diversity increases, and some areas the diversity decreases. So there's not something common across the country. Maybe you could broadly say there's a little more diversity along the coasts and less diversity in the middle of the country. But there is, in recent years, a lot of the country that has, the orange is 3 to 4 varieties and the red is 1 or 2 varieties. No, not varieties, I'm sorry. I was mismaking crops, types of crops. So we don't know what varieties. We do know that there are 2 different kinds of crops planted. So that could be corn and wheat or corn and soy, something like that. Okay. So my point here is just that we don't completely know how much genetic diversity there is in our system. Okay, but without knowing, I'm putting this positive spin on it. Okay, so genetic diversity is good in agriculture, and maintaining genetic diversity in the wild is important for agriculture. So back to the teosinte and the cultivated corn picture, it was actually genes from teosinte that was used to breed resistance to southern corn leaf blight into our cultivated corn varieties. Yay! So that's a victory for our crop wild relatives being used to improve the genetics of our farms. So not only is it important for us to plant diverse corn in our agriculture systems, it's important for us to preserve teosinte genetics in the wild and in seed banks. Okay, so I think this work would make Nikolai Vavilov, the Russian plant scientist, very proud. This is a map showing the, in the kind of red and green region here, wild areas where teosinte grows in Mexico, right? And we know, right, and then the colored areas are areas where landrace or kind of farmer varieties of corn are being grown in the Americas. Similar colors represent that there are similar genetics. So the pink varieties are more similar to each other than they are to the blue varieties. The blue varieties are more similar to each other than the yellow varieties, right? And it's not surprising that similar varieties are geographically linked because those are growing in more similar environments, right? So they have similar genetics, and those similar genetics have them adapted to these similar ecozones, right? There's also some trade patterns and stuff that will affect that. So we know now that corn originally came from this part of Mexico, not just based on the archaeological data, but in comparing the genetic data of cultivated varieties to wild varieties, we can see that they are most similar to the wild varieties of teosinte from this area, which means maybe teosinte from other areas didn't get an opportunity to contribute their genetics to modern corn that we have today, and maybe those other wild teosinte would have better drought-tolerant genes or other things like that. So side note about preserving corn diversity in these land races, there's actually been found in the mountains of Oaxaca, in this infertile soil in an area that's a little bit cold and damp, corn that grows very tall and has some sort of symbiotic nitrogen fixing relationship with a microbe. So it's very exciting to think that we have corn, this grass, this commodity crop that's grown on a lot of acres, may be able to do symbiotic nitrogen fixation, similar to what our legumes and our beans do, which increase soil fertility and add soil health. So there's a lot more research that needs to be done on that. But another example of preserving a landrace variety because it could help to make agriculture more sustainable in the future. So not only do we need to save seeds from farmers markets and from our grandparents and stuff, we also need to preserve the area where that stuff is currently being grown. Here's an example of some diversity in corn. I think it's beautiful. The long ears are what we're familiar with here in the north. The stubby ears are what's more commonly grown down in South America. And the diversity of corn, not only is it adapted to different growing conditions, they also have different cooking, flavor, and nutritional profiles, right? So the purple ears are higher in anthocyanins, which are antioxidants. That's great. The orange ones, right? Those are the ones that produce the vitamin A precursors, right? They say eat your carrots, it's good for your eyes and your immune system. Well, eat your orange corn. It's also good for your eyes and your immune system. And here's a map just, again, representing through the dark brown, the most diverse genetic regions of corn. And so in the Southwest United States, there are some areas of corn genetics that's very diverse and may need to be preserved. And then the lighter regions also were sampled, but they have a little bit less diversity. Okay, so this is getting exciting. So that was our corn example. So how do we preserve this diversity besides just making national parks all around the world? And national parks and like heritage farms, right? Because you can't just let land go fallow for some of these crops. You need to minimally manage them. Well, there's a global system of seed banks, right? And this is just a map showing those that have more than 10,000 accessions. An accession would be a different variety, right? And through the United States, we have gene banks maintained by the USDA. So the blue ones are all national gene banks. The kind of flesh-colored ones are international gene banks. And then this green one in the top is the Svalbard Seed Vault. which is used as a backup storage close to the Arctic Circle for all the other gene banks. And we're going to take a virtual tour of that at the end. So think of a gene bank as a giant freezer that stores seeds at low humidity and cool temperatures, so they stay good for a really long time. So the USDA gene bank system stretches across the United States. For the most part, they keep the plants, the species in the region where they are easiest to propagate. For example, the maize gene stocks are kept in Urbana, Illinois. Aberdeen, Idaho keeps a lot of our common cereal crops, so our oats, rice, rye, wheat. And then Ames, Iowa keeps a lot of our more novel crops. So they have like quinoa and coriander and amaranth there. There are also fruit and vegetables and stuff like that. So this is a system of gene banks set up across the country. And if you are curious about what is there, right, or you are actually interested in even accessing some of these rare crop varieties, you can search the U.S. National Plant Germplasm System. Germplasm is another word for seed or genetic resource. And it's like searching on Amazon. You type in if there's a variety you want and you know that, you could search by disease tolerance, you could search by photoperiod, you could search by leaf color, any trait that's been tracked you could search for, right? And then when you find the one that you want, you add it to your cart and you check out and it's free. So these are not, the gene bank is not for commercial distribution of seeds. You only ever get a tiny amount, right? And it's primarily used for research and breeding. But I currently have 2 students, they're undergraduates doing projects. One of them has access to USDA seed for researching wild soybeans to see if they produce extra hairy leaves that deter deer. Another student is testing all the varieties of San Marzano tomatoes that exist in the gene bank. So it was like 14 varieties, and doesn't matter. But he's going to grow those next to each other here in Pennsylvania compared to a Amish variety to see which grows best, and then do a taste test on them. So that's a wonderful resource, the USDA gene banks. Okay, so you look in the USDA gene banks and you don't find the variety you want. You're looking for your great-grandmother's favorite variety. Well, you can look at the international gene banks, right? So with the great acronyms, CIMMYT is the one that contains the corn and wheat collections. The maize collection of 28,000 accessions, including the world's largest collection of maize landraces and wild relatives, is held in Mexico. And the wheat collection down in Mexico is 150,000 varieties from more than 100 countries with nearly 400 rye varieties. So it's really an incredible resource. Those seeds are also freely distributed. In order to get seeds from the international gene banks, you need an import permit, which I believe is also free to get from the USDA. And they'll need to pass phytosanitary tests, which show that they're disease-free. But it's just a system of paperwork to make sure we're not bringing in more diseases, and it's possible to do. So if you want to order from the International Center, turns out they use the same website format. So just like Amazon, you type in what you want, and you add it to your cart. And this is really exciting that the USDA and the international gene banks are both making this, this resource available and tracking it, because that complaint I had at the beginning that we're no longer tracking variety by acre anymore in the United States is a little high risk to not know how much diversity exists. But then you look at the other end and you see the work that the gene banks are doing for tracking data and making these resources available, makes us think that in the near future, with improved genetic tools and improved data management, maybe we will know how much diversity is out there and what varieties are being planted. So there is a lot of effort to make this user-friendly and to share the information. All right, so the Svalbard Global Seed Vault is the backup gene bank close to the Arctic Circle for all the other gene banks. So we're going to take a virtual tour. It's going to take a minute for this to load. I kind of want to go here for my honeymoon, but they don't allow visitors, so I'll just have to do this virtual tour.
This is the entrance to one of the most remarkable facilities on Earth, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. We're at Plateau Mountain, near the town of Longyearbyen on the Svalbard archipelago, about 1,000 kilometers from the North Pole. It's an extreme environment of glaciers and snow, and where there are more polar bears than people. These kinds of conditions are perfect for storing one of the world's most important resources, seeds. On the other side of these doors lies the largest collection of crop diversity in the world. Welcome. As we open the heavy entrance door, we step into the portal building. Stairs to the right lead to the cooling system and electrical networks for the light sculpture outside. Boxes of seeds from around the world arrive at the seed vault 3 to 4 times a year to be taken deep into the mountain. Seeds of the most important crops for food and agriculture are stored here. As we open the door and begin to walk down the 130-meter-long tunnel, the air gets noticeably cooler. It also becomes clear that the seed vault is not a pristine antiseptic laboratory. It's not meant to be a research station or tourist attraction. Rather, it's a practical facility all about freezing seeds. Pipes overhead carry cold air to the farthest reaches of the vault, where the seeds are stored. We are now deep inside the mountain. While the rock is naturally dark in color, the walls are coated with a mix of plastic fiber and concrete, giving the appearance of snow and ice. You can see 3 sets of doors leading to the seed storage rooms. Only the middle of the 3 rooms is currently in use, the one with the ice-encrusted door. We're now at the final stop on our journey, the vault room, where the seeds are stored. Despite the fact it is bitterly cold at -18 degrees Celsius, a walk down these aisles is a heartwarming experience. There are no political boundaries inside the vault. Boxes from countries all over the world sit side by side, united in the common goal of conserving seeds.
Heartwarming, right? Oh, I messed up the video. So the Svalbard Vault is not a research station, but it's a backup for other backups. And if you go on to watch the next video, what it explains is that there's an empty spot in one of the aisles where seeds were removed from Syria. So the seed bank in Syria and Aleppo was destroyed. And so, but prior to it being destroyed, fortunately, the seeds were backed up in Svalbard. And after the destruction of the seed bank in Aleppo, because of civil war, the seeds were taken out of Svalbard and and then sent to, I think, Morocco and Libya, maybe, in order to be grown again. So they weren't lost. So it's a hopeful story. Yeah. All right, so right outside of Svalbard Seed Vault, this is one of the floating glaciers. It was a photo taken by Anna Davidson. She's an artist, scientist friend of mine. We were actually in grad school together in California. And she had the opportunity to go on an artist's retreat that was on a tall ship sailing at 81 degrees north and just seeing the polar bears and the garbage and the ice and the beauty and the sadness and everything happening with climate change up there. And it was very moving. She did not get to go into the seed vault, but she was there near it. Okay, so the takeaway from this is Okay, I'm not quite sure where National Geographic got this data, but I think the overall idea is very consistent. We're looking at the width of the bar represents the amount of diversity of commercially available food back in 1903, right? So there were 288 varieties of beets commercially sold, 544 varieties of cabbage, and then looking at data from 1983, just 30 years ago, there were 28 varieties of cabbage relative to 544 varieties of cabbage before. So this fact that even of these like delicious vegetables, that what we're producing isn't coming from a lot of varieties compared to what we used to be, may be a precarious place to be in, especially because of climate change, bringing previously unknown stresses to our food system, right? Because just like in a natural ecosystem, having a lot of diversity allows for a lot of resilience and not complete crop failure, just a little bit of crop failure or plant failure. In an agriculture system, having diversity allows for resilience. Okay, but it's not just for resilience, it's also increased quality, right? Because you know that the different tomatoes have different textures and different flavors and colors and stuff like that. So adding diversity in our food system could also enhance it, not just make it stronger. So here's an example of some stuff we've grown at Del Val. So it's a variety of potatoes from the Pennsylvania Potato Co-op, some mixed decorative and edible squashes, a whole bunch of hot peppers, and then Del Val students doing a taste testing of hot sauces and mashed potatoes that they made. So if you guys want to get involved, if you want to impact diversity in agriculture, these are some things you can do. Become a plant breeder. This could be a professional or a backyard breeder. I've got a lesson to follow this depending how the Q&A goes. Save seeds. You can join or start a seed library. This is just free community exchange of seeds. You go in the spring, you check out the seeds you want to grow, you grow the plants over the summer, come fall, harvest your seeds. If they're a variety you like, you put some seeds back in the seed library. Choose to purchase diverse agricultural goods, retail or wholesale. It's easy to go to a farmer's market and get something interesting. Maybe you could step up a notch if you're planning a church or community event or a wedding or ordering for a dining hall. Maybe order something diverse and different on a wholesale level. Contract with farmers to share the risk of planting something novel. Farmers do want to plant diverse things. They'll be adapted to their soil and they'll get a premium price if they're doing something novel, but they need to have someone to buy it. If you are a landowner, I know this is not uncommon in Bucks County and you lease your land to a farmer, consider a long-term land lease so that your farmer can invest in soil health. If you just have a lawn or garden, diversify that. Let the clover and the violets grow right in with your grass. Conserve open land, natural spaces and farmland. Support seed nonprofits. Support the USDA and national gene banks. Study agriculture science and become an agronomist or a geneticist. That's wrong. It's supposed to say support regionality and seasonality of food, not rationality. So support regional and seasonal food. All right, these are, if you're taking notes, some seed saving nonprofits and government groups that do great seed work. So there's the Seed Savers Exchange. They're pretty national. They're located in the middle of the country. National Native Seed Search that specializes in arid crops in the Southwest. The Experimental Farm Network here in New Jersey does exceptional work with seed saving and education. And the Roughwood Table Seed Collection is here in Pennsylvania. Then the USDA National Genetic Resources Program, which had the website where you can order non-commercial varieties of seeds from, as well as the International Genetic Resources Programs. The acronym is CGIAR for them. And Crop Trust, which helps to run that. All right, and then last thing for taking notes. Some projects that I am working on are the Delaware Valley Participatory Plant Breeding Program. My contact information is up there. And if you are interested in participating, no experience necessary. We want gardeners, breeders, chefs, people who want to do taste testing events, all of the above. And the PA Local Grain Coalition. So this is a group of bakers, farmers, brewers, eaters who are interested in not just making improved vegetables for the region, but grains, because grains do contribute. And this could be cereal grains or legumes or bean grains, because those do account for more acreage, more calories, more protein in our agriculture system. So I'm gonna stop the share for a second so I can read some questions. And depending how time goes, we can do a little breeding lesson, or you can reach out and we can do that after. Okay, so are there any local seed banks or exchanges in Bucks County? We are trying to start one at Delaware Valley. I think it was gonna happen this spring. We do have a new student plant breeding club. However, COVID-19 happened. So I don't know of a local seed bank. You can email me after and I'll look around for you. Does the seed bank at Svalbard, does that natural Arctic type of landscape provides? Oh, does the natural Arctic landscape protect the seeds there? Yes, so the location of the Doomsday Vault, the Svalbard Seed Vault, was picked because of it's, even with climate change, it's expected to stay colder and be easier to maintain. Also, Norway has some extra oil money, and so that helped for being able to make it, it needed to be financially sustainable as well. Oh, and the photograph behind me is of the Andes in Colombia near a bean research station, so the International Center of Tropical Agriculture, which has the largest collection of dry beans and lima beans in the world, is down in Colombia. And this is, we were looking for a new place to do seed increases. So we're a few miles from the research station. Okay, somebody asked if the National Geographic showed a decline in corn varieties from 307 to 12 today, and are the 295 that disappeared in one of the seed banks. I don't know if those specific 295 are in seed banks, but there's a good chance. There are thousands of varieties of corn maintained in the seed banks, but they're not all maintained. Some of them have never been collected. They're still being grown by smallholder farmers in villages in Mexico. Okay, so this is new for me to not be getting visual feedback from attendees. I'm used to teaching in class where I can tell if people are getting it or not. But we have about 5 minutes left. I'm gonna do this because I like giving my students too much information, a little intro into plant breeding. And if you like it, follow up with me and we can definitely do more. So I want you to all know that you can be a plant breeder in your home garden. Okay, so plant breeding 101. You need to know the life cycle of a plant. You start with a seed, you get a young plant, which develops into a mature plant. A mature plant is able to flower. You can think of producing a flower like plant puberty, right? And it's only after flowering that a plant can receive pollen, fertilize the egg, which grows the fruit that has the seed on the inside. So the seed is actually the embryo, right? The next generation. And that only happens after pollination happens, right? So you take seed, it's like the embryo, grow the next plant, flower, pollination, and the whole cycle continues again. All right, so you know the plant cycle. Then you need to know basic flower anatomy, because you need to know what's the female part, where the egg is, and what is the male part that's going to make the pollen, and inside the pollen is where the sperm is. So general flower anatomy, you have the outside protective layer of the bud, the sepals, then the petals are the next whorl within that. Petals are decoration. They're there to attract the pollinator, make them want to come and transport the pollen. Then the next whorl inside there is the male whorl, so that would be the anthers that produce the pollen. And in the center is the carpel, is the female part. So this is the receptive tip, and at the base of the carpel is where the ovaries will be, and where the eggs will be. Okay, very simplified version because plants are all sorts of different sexes and things like that. If you can imagine something, the plant world is doing it. All right, so basically, if you want to make a hybrid, you would take the pollen from flower A and move it to the stigma of flower B. That would be a hybrid, right? If you wanted to make an inbred, you would take the pollen from flower B and put it on the stigma of flower B, right? Self-fertilization, hybrid. So if you have a hot pepper and a sweet pepper and you want to make a medium pepper, you would cross those together. It's not really that simple. You'll actually end up with a hot pepper, but the next generation will be weird. Okay, so not all flowers are the same though. Something like squash actually has different male and female flowers. Squash is a really easy crop to start with for plant breeding because it has different sexed flowers. So the next image is even better. You can tell it's the female because there's the ovary underneath. You know what? The ovary looks like an immature fruit because that's what it is. So again, female squash, you can tell because it has the immature fruit at the base of it. Male squash flower, no immature fruit. If you look down in the flower, it also looks different. The male will produce a whole bunch of pollen, the female won't. So what you do the night before, when it's just a little more immature than this, you would rubber band both of these shut to keep those pesky pollinators out, and then come out in the morning, gently remove the rubber bands from the tip, and shake the pollen from the male onto the female, because remember, the pollen contains the sperm. Rubber band these petals delicately shut again to keep those pesky pollinators out, and let the pollen sperm do its thing. Within a day, you'll see if the ovary swells, or if the fruit begins to form, or if it is aborted. Another easy plant to do a cross on would be corn, because like squash, you have separate female flowers. The ear that produces the silk is where the pollen is received, and then the male flower is the tassel at the top. There's a ton of videos on YouTube for how to do plant crosses at home. So whatever plant you want to try, check out a YouTube video. It's a little bit harder to do crosses on flowers that produce both male and female parts next to each other because of the nature of them touching, right? So you have wheat, soybeans, cotton, produce their pollen right next to the female receptive part, and so they self-fertilize so easily. So what you do for those, another one would be tomatoes and peppers, is you can use tweezers to emasculate them. So you gently dissect the flower. So this will be an immature flower that hasn't opened yet. You remove the sepals, the outer layer, the petals, and the anthers. So all you have left is the female receptive organ, right? So you have the ovaries at the bottom. This is the style. This is where the pollen is supposed to land. And then you use an adjacent flower and you rub the pollen from an adjacent mature flower on the tip of the stigma. And then you could put a little covering on this to prevent a pollinator from interfering. However, with the petals removed, pollinators aren't going to be that interested in this anyway. Similar for peppers. So tweezers, and you want to label your cross after you do it. You want some jewelry tags that are plastic to hold them in place. Another thing, if you don't want to do the cross, you can buy F1 or hybrid seed and save the seeds from that, and that will, the progeny will all be different varieties, which is really cool, and it saves you a step of having to do a cross. And last fun fact, we're looking at a wild tomato versus a domesticated tomato. Domesticated tomato has its female part, the stigma, completely inside the anthers so that it self-fertilizes, right? So it is already fertilized here, whereas the wild tomato, it wants to cross-fertilize, so the stigma, the female part, protrudes beyond the male part to encourage cross-pollination, because in the wild, you want genetic variation because that is evolutionarily advantageous for your species to have a lot of difference. In agriculture, though, we seem to want uniformity. All right, I'm gonna stop it again, see if there's any more questions. This has been a pleasure. Are there local resources to assist with diversity in home landscapes? There are landscaping companies in Bucks County that specialize on this. A woman in my book club, Beverly, I can't remember her name, but she's a landscape designer and she specializes in native plants, and I've come across quite a few. So yes, there are people who do that. Also, Doug Ptolemy has written a few books on how you can convert your suburban garden into a ecosystem servicing landscape where native pollinators and birds and everything will really thrive, and your neighbors will still love you because your garden will look decent. So that's Doug Ptolemy, writes great books on diversifying your home landscape. How many people are there out collecting seeds? I love this question. So I've been interested in doing this for 10 years, and I've been on one collection trip with the USDA. There are not a lot, but there are some. Working for the USDA gene bank system is a way to get paid to be one. These guys in Columbia, who are in the picture behind me, working at the International Research Centers, do it sometimes. University professors occasionally, if they're lucky. Still looking for a plant patron. When people ask what my dream job is, it would be to be a seed explorer. Can you have a hybrid seed and replant it? Definitely, but you won't get the same thing as the parent. So because of the genetics of the hybrid are heterozygous, which means they're 50% inherited from parent A and 50% inherited from parent B. So when that hybrid self-pollinates and makes the next generation, there's a chance that there is genetic mixing that happens when it forms its sperm and its egg. And whatever blend you get is kind of random. So how you and your siblings all look different because your parents are different is sort of, it's more complicated than that, what you'll get. So you can definitely replant hybrid seeds. They'll just be a different variety. A comment is Matt Kolaski's sister was a corn detasseler in Michigan. Then that's still a job you can get here in Pennsylvania. There's some crop research stations who hire detasselers. All right. So that's all I have for you guys today. I'm not sure how to wrap up officially.
Thank you, Sarah. This was such a great presentation. I'm sure everyone who attended, and thank you all for your great questions. I'm sure you all were able to get all the information from Sarah. So thank you, panelists. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, all the attendees. And we'll have a happy rest of your Earth Day, everyone. We'll see you later. Bye.
So I guess I'm still here. Thanks, guys. Thank you. And definitely follow up if you have more questions. It's so weird to not be able to hear you guys and just see this random stream of questions. I'll put up my contact information once more for